in the heart of a bustling Chase Bank on an otherwise uneventful afternoon. The glass doors creaked open to reveal a man who seemed out of place in every sense. Dwayne Johnson, 53 years old, a black man with a weathered face etched by time and hardship, stepped hesitantly into the lobby. His thick, dark brown coat, patched and threadbare, hung heavily from his shoulders. His shoes were so worn, the soles flapped slightly with each slow, deliberate step. On his shoulder was an old canvas bag, its fabric faded and fraying from decades of use. The room's chatter dimmed for a moment as heads turned toward this unexpected figure, then rose into mocking whispers. A middle-aged white woman dressed in a crisp designer suit clutched her purse tighter, her expression flickering between irritation and wariness. Behind the counters, a young teller smirked, nudging his colleague. "Looks like he wandered in by mistake," he whispered, loud enough for a few nearby customers to hear. His colleague nodded, their shared laughter dripping with disdain. But Dwayne didn't flinch. His deep brown eyes scanned the room calmly, his gaze firm, unwavering, seemingly unaffected by the snide comments and derisive glances. Then, as if the air itself thickened, Dwayne took one more step forward. His voice was soft, but carried weight, a quiet thunder that silenced the murmurs. "This bank," he said evenly, "belongs to me." For a heartbeat, there was stunned silence. Then, like a wave crashing against a rock, the lobby erupted into laughter. The sound was sharp, dismissive, and filled with the kind of mocking that comes from generations of unexamined prejudice. Some customers turned to each other, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others whispered insults barely veiled beneath thin smiles. Stephen Miller, the tall, broad-shouldered security guard with a crew cut and a stiff uniform, started toward Dwayne, his brows knitted with scorn. His hand rested almost casually on the grip of his holstered sidearm, a silent warning that he was ready to enforce the perceived order of the space. But Dwayne didn't back down. He straightened his shoulders, standing tall and resolute amidst the storm of laughter and contempt. His hands trembled slightly, but he gripped the worn strap of his canvas bag as though it anchored him against the tide of disdain. The bag seemed insignificant, almost pitiful, yet there was something in the way he carried it, like it held the weight of something far heavier than its outward appearance suggested. The laughter around him started to fade, replaced by a curious tension. Some customers whispered to each other, wondering if this man was delusional or dangerous. A few even began inching toward the doors, just in case. But Dwayne remained calm, his deep voice slicing through the air with quiet authority. "I'm not lost," he said steadily, his gaze locked on the heart of the bank. "I'm here to reclaim what was taken from me a long time ago." Even as the tension mounted and the laughter resumed, louder and sharper, there was a shift in the room. Though many still dismissed him as a poor, delusional old man, a few began to sense that this was more than just an intrusion. Dwayne's presence, his calmness amidst the jeers, the way he gripped that faded canvas bag, hinted at a truth that had yet to unfold. In that moment, Chase Bank's familiar hum of business as usual fractured just slightly with a ripple of unease. And as Dwayne Johnson stood alone in the center of the lobby, unbowed by ridicule and disdain, a storm, silent for now, began to gather on the horizon. The mocking laughter in the Chase Bank lobby continued to swell, each snicker and sneer a stab at Dwayne Johnson's dignity. Customers whispered behind cupped hands, their eyes darting away when his gaze met theirs. The young tellers behind the counter whispered to each other, their smirks thinly veiled. "This old man must be drunk," one muttered, nudging his friend, who replied with a snicker, "Probably thinks this is the welfare office." Their words weren't hushed enough to escape Dwayne's ears, but he showed no outward reaction. Instead, he stood rooted to the marble floor, his weathered hands gripping the strap of his faded canvas bag. His eyes, deep, resolute, remained. fixed on the main counter where James Temp, the bank manager, stood. James, a man in his 40s with meticulously combed blonde hair and a tailored suit, watched the scene unfold with cool detachment. His icy blue eyes held the faintest flicker of disdain, though he made a token effort to mask it behind a tight, polite smile. As the room buzzed with whispered jokes and low laughter, James signaled subtly for Stephen Miller, the security guard, to handle the situation. Stephen's large frame moved toward Dwayne, his expression one of exasperation and veiled hostility. He gestured toward the entrance and spoke in a tone dripping with condescension. "Hey, old man," he said, his voice a low growl. "This isn't a place for you to wander in and cause trouble. You'd better leave before I have to get physical." His hand hovered over his gun holster, fingers twitching slightly, but Dwayne didn't flinch. His steady voice, though soft, cut through the tension in the room like a knife through thick air. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his words carrying a quiet weight. "I'm here to take back what's mine, what this bank took from me over 50 years ago." His words echoed through the lobby, causing a ripple of confusion and disbelief. Conversation ceased. Laughter sputtered. People turned to one another, eyebrows raised, unsure if they'd heard correctly. James Temp's eyes narrowed, a crease forming between his brows. He stepped out from behind the counter, his tone calm yet impatient. "Sir, I'm not sure what you think, but you're mistaken," he said, his voice firm but polite. "This bank has been here for decades, owned by the Matthews family since my grandfather's time. You must be confusing it with something else." There was a faint smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, the kind of expression that barely masked his disbelief. "I'm not mistaken," Dwayne replied firmly. His voice was clear, his tone steady, as he slowly placed his old canvas bag on the floor in front of him. The bag's worn fabric and frayed edges spoke of decades of hardship, of stories long hidden. "I'll show you right here, right now," he said, his voice low but commanding. The surrounding customers, who moments earlier had jeered and mocked, now found themselves inexplicably drawn in, their curiosity piqued by the old man's confidence. Stephen's impatience flared visibly as he stepped closer to Dwayne, his posture stiff, his voice sharp. "I'm warning you one last time, old man. Either you leave or I'll call the police. Don't make this worse for yourself." His hand hovered once more over his gun, the tension in his stance palpable. But Dwayne remained unshaken. Slowly, with deliberate movements, he bent down and began to untie the string of his canvas bag. His hands, though trembling from age, moved with an unyielding steadiness. Each knot loosened seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. Even Stephen, despite his aggressive stance, paused, caught off guard by the old man's unwavering calm. Inside, the bag was something that, when revealed, would silence every voice in the lobby. But for now it remained a mystery, a secret so deeply buried that its mere hint was enough to hold the entire room in a suspended, uneasy quiet. The lobby of Chase Bank fell into a tense silence as Dwayne Johnson bent down to open his canvas. A bag. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of years carried in the worn fabric. Each movement was deliberate, steady, as though he were peeling back layers of a truth long hidden. All eyes in the bank were fixed on him. Even Stephen Miller, who had approached with such aggressive intent, found himself pausing, his hand resting uncertainly on his gun holster. Then, with a quiet whisper of fabric against fabric, the mouth of the bag slowly opened. The first thing to emerge was a bundle of old, faded money. Bills yellowed with age tumbled out onto the polished marble floor, scattering in disarray. The sight was so unexpected, so out of place, that a ripple of shocked silence swept through the lobby. Some customers instinctively stepped back, their eyes wide with disbelief. Others leaned in, curiosity flickering through their skepticism. Stephen's scowl deepened. His voice rang out sharply, breaking the fragile silence. "That's enough," he barked, his tone laced with irritation and thinly veiled contempt. "This is a bank, not a shelter for wandering old men causing trouble." His words hung in, the air sharp and heavy, drawing murmurs of agreement from a few bystanders. Their expressions, however, were no longer purely dismissive. There was a tinge of uncertainty, a hint of something they couldn't quite explain. Dwayne remained motionless, his calm demeanor unshaken, his eyes deep and unwavering locked onto Stephen's. "I'm not causing trouble," he said, his voice quiet yet strong. "I've come to reclaim what rightfully belongs to me. What you call me, what you think of me, it doesn't change. The truth." His words, spoken with a quiet confidence, carried a weight that seemed to ripple through the room, making even Stephen hesitate. James Temp, who had been watching the scene unfold from behind the counter, finally stirred. A flicker of doubt passed across his face as he glanced between the old, faded money and the determined figure standing before him. Clearing his throat, he stepped forward, his voice striving for calm professionalism. "Stephen, please, let's not escalate this any further," he said. His gaze flicked toward Dwayne, but his tone remained cautious. "Sir, if you truly have any evidence, we'll review it. But first, I must ask that you stop causing a disturbance in the bank." Dwayne gave a slight nod, his expression one of quiet acceptance. Slowly, he reached into his bag once more and pulled out a worn, yellowed ledger. The book was thick, its edges frayed, its cover cracked from years of use. As he held it aloft for everyone to see, his voice rang out, clear and steady. "This is the original ledger of Chase Bank from 1948, he said, his tone infused with both gravity and resolve. "It contains my name, Dwayne Johnson, as the rightful founder of this bank before it was stolen from me through greed and racial prejudice." A heavy silence descended over the lobby as Dwayne's declaration echoed against the marble walls. Astonished and confused glances darted around the room. Some customers clung to their skepticism, while others found themselves shifting uneasily, their minds struggling to reconcile the story they had just heard with the evidence before their eyes. James Temp's face turned pale, his hand trembling as he absorbed the implications of the name Dwayne Johnson etched into the brittle pages of the ledger. Stephen Miller, though still wearing a mask of hostility, stepped back slightly, his hand lowering from his holster, doubt flickering behind his stern expression. The weight of the truth in Dwayne's words was beginning to crack through the thick walls of disbelief that had once filled the Chase Bank lobby. A sharp crack echoed as Stephen Miller stepped forward, his heavy boot deliberately striking the marble floor. The sound shattered the thick silence, as if he were trying to reassert his dominance over the room. "Enough of this nonsense," Stephen barked, his voice booming and filled with frustration. His face flushed red, veins pulsing visibly at his temples. His hand hovered dangerously close to his holster, a silent threat that made several customers instinctively recoil. His words cut through the air with venom. "This is a bank, not a place for wandering black men to stir up trouble." The insult, loud and clear, caused an audible gasp to ripple through the lobby. Some customers shifted uncomfortably, others exchanged uneasy glances. The mocking laughter that had once filled the room now gave way to a thick, heavy silence. The bank employees who had earlier whispered behind the counters took subtle steps back, their eyes flickering with discomfort as they realized the gravity of the situation unfolding before them. But Dwayne Johnson remained standing tall. His weathered face held no hint of fear, only a calm, unwavering determination. His deep eyes met Stephen's with a gaze so steady it made the younger man's bravado falter. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Dwayne said, his voice steady and clear, each word deliberate. "I'm here to reclaim what is rightfully mine. What you call me, what you think of me, does not change the truth. The truth doesn't bow to insults." Stephen hesitated, his aggressive posture wavering as Dwayne's quiet strength pressed against his own bluster. For a moment, the younger man stood locked in an unspoken battle, his hand still hovering near his gun. But before he could act, a new voice rose from behind the counter. Emily Carter, the youngest bank employee, a woman known for her reserved, cautious nature, stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly, but her expression resolute. She walked across the floor, her heels clicking softly against the marble, until she stood near the scattered old money. Bending down, she picked up a faded bill, its edges worn and its colors dulled by time. Holding it in both hands, she turned toward Dwayne, and with a steady voice that rang across the tense lobby, declared, "I believe you, Mr. Johnson." A ripple of shock passed through the room. All eyes turned toward Emily, whose small but powerful act stood as a silent declaration. She placed the faded bill gently on the counter, a quiet but firm gesture of support. Behind her, Josh, the young teller who had earlier ridiculed Dwayne, shifted uncomfortably. His cheeks flushed, and after a brief hesitation, he too stepped forward. Picking up another faded bill, he placed it beside Emily's, his voice low but sincere. "I believe you too, Mr. Johnson. I'm sorry for what I said earlier." One by one, other bank employees, inspired by the courage of Emily and Josh, followed suit. Each person picked up an old bill, laying it before Dwayne as if offering a silent apology for their earlier dismissal. Some spoke soft words of respect, others remained silent, their actions speaking louder than words. Stephen Miller stood frozen, his jaw clenched, his hand twitching slightly near his holster. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a swirling mix of confusion and rising anger. The tide in the lobby had shifted. What had begun as a scene of mockery and scorn was transforming into something else, something that unsettled him deeply. At the heart of it all, Dwayne Johnson remained steady. His calm presence seemed to pull the truth from the shadows, forcing everyone in the room to face what they had long ignored. The atmosphere thickened with the weight of realization, as if the walls of Chase Bank themselves were bearing witness to a long overdue reckoning. James Temp stood frozen, caught between the crumbling facade of power and the undeniable force of truth. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched the aged ledger Dwayne Johnson had placed before him. His mind raced through years of bank records and familiar stories of the Matthews family's proud ownership, but the evidence in his hands told a different story, a story of betrayal and stolen legacy. His carefully maintained composure began to fracture under the weight of realization. Dwayne stood still, his eyes locked on James with quiet, unyielding strength. The old man's voice was calm, yet it resonated with a power that filled the room. "Every dollar in this bank, every brick you stand on, was built from my sacrifice and dreams," Dwayne said. "But because of greed and prejudice, it was stolen from me." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable, forcing everyone in the lobby to confront the weight of history. Stephen Miller, his jaw tight, stepped forward once more, his voice strained with disbelief. "How do we even know this isn't some scam? Where would someone like you even get this?" His words, though loud, were edged with an undercurrent of doubt, a hint that even he could no longer fully dismiss the truth that was unfolding before him. Dwayne's response was unwavering. "Because I am Dwayne Johnson, the man this very bank stole from," he said. His voice was low, each word cutting through the air with a quiet authority. "And now, I've come to take it back." James Temp's face flushed pale, his hands gripping the ledger more tightly as his heart pounded against his ribs. The lines of signatures, the aged paper, and the matching details were undeniable. He realized that the truth was not just standing before him, but glaring back at him from the very records he had trusted for years. A hush fell over the bank lobby, the weight of the revelation settling like a heavy fog. Some customers stood in stunned silence, others exchanged nervous glances. For years, they had believed the story told to them, the story of the Matthews family's legacy. Now it was clear that the narrative was a lie, carefully crafted to erase a man like Dwayne Johnson from history. James took a shaky breath, his eyes flickering between Dwayne's resolute face and the documents in his hands. His thoughts raced, but for the first time, he felt the weight of his own conscience pressing against him. Stephen's voice, sharp and accusing, cut through his hesitation. "James, are you really buying this? Are you going to throw everything we've built away for the claims of an old man?" James turned to Stephen, his expression taut with inner conflict. For years, he had been the enforcer of the Matthews family's legacy, the confident face of Chase Bank's pristine reputation. But now, staring into Dwayne's eyes, he realized that his silence would mean continuing a legacy built on lies. "Mr. Miller," James said, his voice trembling but clear, "we can't act rashly. These documents, they're authentic. Mr. Johnson deserves to be heard." The room shifted. The bank employees, once silent and complicit, now watched with a mixture of apprehension and hope. Emily Carter stepped forward, her eyes shining with resolve. "You're not alone, James," she said softly, her voice carrying across the room. "We'll stand with you. This bank needs to change, and it starts here." James's gaze met Emily's, and for a moment he felt the burden of leadership settle heavily on his shoulders. His next words would not only define his own legacy, but also determine the future of the bank and everyone in it. "I will take this to the board," he said finally, his voice strong and resolute. "I know the risks, but I would rather sacrifice everything than continue living and working in a place built on injustice and lies." The bank lobby fell into a heavy silence as his words echoed. One by one, heads nodded, the air thick with a mixture of fear, hope, and a newfound sense of unity. Dwayne stood quietly, his eyes glistening not with triumph, but with a deep, quiet understanding that the tide was finally irreversibly turning. The air in Chase Bank had thickened to the point where every breath felt weighted. Stephen Miller's face was flushed with rising frustration and anger as he realized the tides had shifted. The same people who had once whispered and laughed were now standing silently behind Dwayne Johnson and James Temp, their eyes wide with unease. In a desperate bid to regain control, Stephen's hand shot toward his gun holster. His voice, filled with authority and desperation, cracked the silence. "Enough!" he shouted, his tone laced with panic. "This old man is causing trouble. All of this so-called evidence, it's fake. I won't let him tear down everything we've built." The sudden escalation sent a ripple of fear through the lobby. Customers instinctively stepped back, inching toward the exits, some with their phones in hand, recording the unfolding scene. Others stood frozen, their wide eyes darting between Stephen's hand, hovering over his gun, and Dwayne's steady figure. Dwayne didn't flinch. His calm, unwavering gaze was locked on Stephen, a silent challenge to the security guard's authority. "Mr. Miller," Dwayne said quietly, his voice carrying despite the tension thickening the room, "I'm not here to destroy anything. I'm here to bring the truth to light. Do you really think it's right to cover up a crime that's been hidden for over 50 years? Stephen's hand tightened around the grip of his gun, his body trembling with the weight of conflicting emotions, anger, confusion, and the dawning realization that the old man standing before him might not be lying. His eyes darted wildly, looking for support from the other employees, but all he found were averted gazes and faces etched with uncertainty. "I don't know what you're talking about," Stephen snapped back, his voice breaking under the strain. "And I don't care. You've already turned this place into chaos. Sit down and wait for the police to arrive." James Temp finally found his voice, stepping forward with a hand raised, his tone trembling but laced with authority. "Stephen, calm down," he said, trying to diffuse the situation. "Let's just look at the documents before doing anything drastic. This isn't as simple as you think." But Stephen's mind was clouded with rage and fear. His voice rose louder, almost Cracking. Are you seriously believing this man's lies, James? Are you just going to let him destroy the reputation of this bank and everyone's jobs? The tension in the lobby snapped tighter, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. Customers watched with bated breath, some recording with their phones, others exchanging nervous glances. Even those who had initially mocked Dwayne now looked uncertain, their loyalty to the familiar crumbling under the weight of the truth. Dwayne stood unmoving, his face calm, his hands loose at his sides. His eyes met Stephen's again, steady and resolute. "This isn't about destroying the bank," he said softly but clearly. "It's about justice, about acknowledging the truth that has been hidden for too long." His voice carried a gravity that resonated in the silent space, making even Stephen hesitate for a heartbeat. Stephen's breathing grew heavier, his grip on his gun trembling as his mind battled between the pride he'd always associated with his authority and the stark reality unraveling before him. His instincts screamed for him to act, to shut down the chaos, but a part of him, the part he'd ignored for years, was beginning to recognize that Dwayne's presence was not just a disturbance, but a reckoning. James took another step forward, his voice firm despite the shaking in his hands. "Stephen, listen to me," he said. "You don't need to do this. Put the gun down. This doesn't need to escalate any further." But Stephen was already too far gone, his desperation painted across his face. "No, James," he snapped, his voice rising. "You're the one who needs to stop. We can't just let him tear this place apart. Everything we've worked for, everything we've built, it'll all be gone." The lobby seemed to contract with the weight of his words. Every eye was fixed on Stephen's trembling hand. The next moment would decide everything. The fragile line between justice and chaos, between truth and the comforting lie that had sustained them for so long. And in that breathless silence, the world seemed to pause, waiting for the next move. James Temp stood at the edge of the unfolding crisis, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes locked on Stephen's trembling hand, still gripping the handle of his gun. The lobby of Chase Bank was now a crucible of tension so thick it was suffocating. Dwayne Johnson remained steady in the center of it all, his voice calm, his presence unshaken. "Mr. Miller," Dwayne said again, his tone firm yet compassionate, "you don't have to do this. I'm not your enemy. I'm not here to destroy anyone. I'm here because the truth needs to be seen. Justice demands it." But Stephen was beyond hearing. His face was flushed with frustration and fear, his eyes darting wildly as though searching for some hidden support in the crowd of now silent witnesses. His voice rose in desperation. "You're destroying everything we've built, everything this bank stands for. You think I'm just going to stand here and let you tear it all down with your lies?" James's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to step forward, his voice shaking yet clear. "Stephen, enough," he said, the authority in his words rising despite the tremor in his tone. "Lower your weapon. This isn't the way. I've seen the evidence. Dwayne Johnson's documents are real. This isn't a scam. This is the truth we've been hiding from." Stephen's eyes widened in disbelief, his grip on the gun tightening involuntarily. "You're siding with him?" he demanded, his voice cracking under the strain. "You're just going to let him destroy everything?" James shook his head slowly, his voice now resolute and calm. "I'm not siding with anyone. I'm standing with the truth. If we continue to hide from it, we're complicit in the lies. I won't do that anymore." For a long, tense moment, the room held its collective breath. Stephen's hand trembled violently. His chest heaved as though he were caught between two worlds, the familiar comfort of power and the rising force of truth. His voice, when it came, was low and thick with bitterness. "You know the Matthews family won't let this go, James," he said. "You're bringing ruin on yourself and on all of us. Do you even understand the consequences?" James's jaw tightened. His voice was quiet but firm, each word carrying the weight of his decision. "I do," he said. "But if I let this truth be buried again, I'll lose something more important than a job or a reputation. I'll lose my soul." He took a deep breath and stepped fully between Dwayne and Stephen, his posture no longer hesitant but unwavering. "This is our chance to set things right. No matter how powerful the Matthews family is, they can't bury the truth forever. It's already out." For a moment, Stephen's hand hovered uncertainly near his holster, his lips pressed into a thin line, his body tense as a coiled spring. But then, slowly, reluctantly, his hand dropped. He slid the gun back into its holster. With a sharp click, the tension in the room releasing like a snapped wire, his face remained hard, his jaw tight, but there was no fight left in his eyes. "You'll regret this decision, James," he muttered, his voice low with disappointment and resentment. James met his gaze with quiet determination. "Maybe," he said softly, "but I'd rather face the consequences of standing up for what's right than live with the regret of staying silent." Around them, the bank employees who had once been silent now watched with a new sense of respect. Emily Carter's eyes glistened with quiet pride. Josh and the others stood taller, their silent expressions of solidarity reflecting the shift that had taken hold. And in the center of it all, Dwayne stood with a soft, almost imperceptible smile. One, born not of victory, but of quiet gratitude. For the first time in over 50 years, he was no longer alone. What started as a moment of laughter and scorn ended in a revelation so powerful. It shattered the walls of injustice and prejudice that had stood for decades. Dwayne Johnson's quiet dignity, unwavering strength, and the truth he carried sparked not just a reckoning inside those marble walls, but a ripple of hope far beyond. This story is a reminder that no matter how long the shadows of injustice stretch, the light of truth will always pierce through. If this story moved you, made you angry, made you feel something, don't let it end here. Hit like to stand with justice, share this story to keep the conversation going, and subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire, challenge, and bring us closer to the truth. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about what it takes to make a difference, one truth at a time.